Hello and welcome. In this video, I'll be showing you how to find and interpret unemployment data. After watching this, you should have the confidence to quickly access and understand the unemployment data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics right from the source without needing the media to filter it for you. I'll show you the key stats to look for, including some of the lesser known ones that might become important and perhaps underreported as this unprecedented wave of job losses continues. If you haven't watched the first video yet, make sure that you do so. Important information was covered there about where this data comes from and definitions of concepts like labor force, unemployment rate, marginally attached to the labor force, discouraged workers, and so on. Without a good understanding of these concepts, you won't be able to properly look at the data here, so please watch that first if you haven't already. To find the BLS unemployment data, type BLS employment summary into your search engine. You can also access it from the main BLS site as well, but this is the quickest way to get there. This brings you to the Employment Situation Summary, which is released every month. Everything you'll need will be available on this page. Technically, it's released on the morning of the third Friday after the reference week, which is on the 12th of each month. But basically, it's the first Friday of each month, sometimes the second Friday if the Friday occurs on the first of the month. So for this month, since May 1st was on a Friday, it was released on May 8th. It's important to keep in mind that the reference week is when they do the survey and get all of the data. This is whichever the week the 12th happens to fall on. So that's a snapshot of the data. It's not some comprehensive look at the entire month. Normally this isn't a big issue since things don't rapidly change, but since literally millions of people a week are now losing their jobs in this coronavirus environment, it's something to keep in mind. As when we say the jobs numbers for April, let's say, it only includes the middle of April, not the latter part of the month. The report begins with a synopsis of the data, and at the bottom there are links to several data tables which display all of the data. The synopsis is worth reading as it outlines most of the key points and sometimes gives you some context as well. Like here where it says the unemployment rate increased by 10.3 percentage points to 14.7%. This is the highest rate and the largest over the month increase in the history of the series. So you might not have known that by just looking at the data tables alone. And basically the synopsis is what many media articles use when reporting the unemployment data. There are two surveys that comprise each month's report, the household survey and the establishment survey. The household survey was covered in the last video, and this is where stats like the unemployment rate, labor force participation rate, marginally attached to the labor force come from. And the establishment survey is similar to this, but it only surveys businesses. Thus, it's not as comprehensive as the household survey because it doesn't include some like self-employed or unincorporated businesses, but the establishment survey does give us the so-called jobs number, the number of payrolls added or lost during the prior month. It also gives us a good look at the job numbers for each industry, as well as hourly earnings and hours worked. So if you look at the synopsis, it begins with the household survey data, and it breaks that down, and then below that, we have the establishment survey data, and it breaks that down. Another reason it's a good idea to read through the synopsis is to see if there are any notes about the data. In this month's report, there was a rather important note on the bottom that many missed, so if we scroll all the way down, so here it says there was also a large increase in the number of workers who were classified as employed but absent from work. As was the case in March, special instructions sent to household survey interviewers called for all employed persons absent from work due to coronavirus-related business closures to be classified as unemployed on temporary layoff. However, it is apparent that not all such workers were so classified. If the workers who were recorded as employed but absent from work due to other reasons over and above the number absent for other reasons in a typical April had been classified as unemployed on temporary layoff, the overall unemployment rate would have been almost 5 percentage points higher than reported. So this basically means that since there was an error with classifying the data, we can basically add 5 percentage points to all of the unemployment rates. So as bad as these numbers were, they were actually even worse, which you wouldn't have known unless you read this note at the very bottom. There's some news outlets that did pick up on this, but often it wasn't highlighted. Below the synopsis is the data tables. These are broadly broken up into two types, data table A and data table B. So data table A comes from the household survey, while data table B comes from the establishment survey. Feel free to look through all of them on your own if you want to see the data available, but I'll go ahead and cover the most relevant and important ones that you'll normally want to examine. This will save you time and concentrate your energy wisely as it's sort of overwhelming to look at them all. So the first one we're going to want to look at is on the very top there, Summary Table A. The Summary Table A is where you're going to find most of the headline data from the household survey. And the most cited statistics will be right there on the top. So you have your civilian labor force number, the labor force participation rate, then it'll count the number of employed and unemployed, as well as of course the unemployment rate and those not in the labor force. It then gives us the data for the most current month as well as the 2 previous months, and then the year prior, as well as the last column there, the change from the previous month to the current month. So for example, we can see the unemployment rate in February was just 3.5%, and then it started climbing 4.4 and then spiked dramatically in April up to 14.7, which was a change of 10.3 points in just 1 month. And going forward, make sure you pay attention to the employment population ratio. It's not often cited, but I think it'll become very relevant and important going forward. You might have heard a lot of people covering the labor force participation rate last month and noting that it fell from 62.7 to 60.2, which was indeed a big drop, but if we look at the employment population ratio, that actually fell from 60 to 51.3, so a much larger drop. And if we remember from the last video, the employment population ratio is what probably most people think the labor force participation rate is, because remember, the labor force participation rate does not include the marginally attached to the labor force. So if people start leaving the labor force and not actively looking for work because maybe the economy is just really bad and there's no work, then you might see the employment population ratio really start to diverge from the labor force participation rate in the future. Below the headline data, the summary chart breaks down the unemployment rate by age groups, sex, race, ethnicity, education, so sometimes that is useful information to find. And at the bottom, there's a few nuggets that you want to pay attention to, as again, I think these will be important going forward. The first is the duration of unemployment. So this tells us how long people have been unemployed for. So if we look at the less than 5 weeks category, we can see that it spiked from 3.5 million to over 14 million in April. And we can see that makes up the bulk of all the unemployed right now, which makes sense given the lockdowns, but we'll want to keep an eye on this as the months wear on to see how that changes, if there's a significant portion of the people that have been unemployed for much longer than 5 weeks. Below that, we have the employed persons working part-time section, and this is divided into part-time for economic reasons and part-time for non-economic reasons. This is a little bit confusing language, but basically part-time for economic reasons is also known as involuntary part-time. So these are people that would prefer to work full-time, but for some reason they are only able to find part-time work. And it's subdivided into slack work or business conditions and could only find part-time work. So it'll be interesting to see as, again, the months wear on to see if this part-time for economic reasons really starts spiking if people are only able to find part-time work. Because remember, the part-time workers are not counted as unemployed, so they're not going to show up in the unemployment rate. And then at the very bottom, we have the marginally attached to the labor force category and discouraged workers. So remember, the marginally attached to the labor force are the people that would like a job, but they haven't been actively looking in the last 4 weeks. And then discouraged workers is a subset of that. And those are people who aren't looking because they feel that there's no jobs available. So again, this is going to be important to keep our eye on going forward because these categories are not counted in the unemployment rate, nor are they even counted in the labor force participation rate. So just looking at those statistics might not tell us the whole story if we have a lot of people that become marginally attached to the labor force. Next, we'll look at the other summary for Table B. This table is going to give us the headline numbers from the establishment survey. Of primary interest here is the number of jobs created or lost, and that's going to be on the very top there. So we can see in April there were 20.5 million jobs that were lost according to this survey, and then again we can see the previous 2 months as well as the year prior. The table then breaks down the jobs numbers by different industries, so this can be useful if you want to see which sectors got hit the hardest or did the best. So it breaks down by, for instance, mining and logging, construction, manufacturing, etc. Particular interest in this last month was leisure and hospitality. We can see they lost 7.6 million jobs, so they got hit really hard, which makes sense with all the restaurants being closed. But it'll be interesting in the upcoming months to see which sectors do the best and worst. Below that, the table breaks down hours and earnings of all employees, which is useful information, although I do want to point out one thing with last month's data. If we look at average hourly earnings, jumped from $28.67 up to $30.01 an hour, which sounds like good news. People were making more money, but we do have to understand that a lot of people were laid off, particularly the lower paid workers. So this will affect the average. So it's not like it was increasing for good reasons. Then at the very bottom, we have the diffusion index. This is seldom reported on, but it tells us how many businesses were increasing employment versus decreasing employment. So a number of 50 here would mean that equal amounts of businesses are increasing employment versus decreasing. Things are stable. If we look at last year, the number was 62.4, so that was pretty good. More businesses were increasing their employment. And if we look at last month, it was 4.8, so that's a pretty terrible number. Means only 5% of businesses were increasing their employment, while 95% weren't. So that's a breakdown of how to read summary tables A and B. This is where the most high profile and important data is found, so that's where you're going to want to begin your search. If you want to go deeper and get into more detail, get into the weeds with the unemployment data, you can check out the other tables. But I'm going to point out 3 tables in particular that I think are worth keeping your eye on and paying attention to, and that's tables A14, 15, and 16. So we'll start with table A14. Table A14 is useful because it breaks down the unemployment rate into different industries. So this allows us to easily compare which sectors are doing the best and who's doing the worst. For example, in April, we see that leisure and hospitality had a 39.3% unemployment rate, which was vastly higher than any other category, while the lowest was in financial activities at just 5.4%. And if we look at table A15, this is very useful because it breaks down the different types of unemployment rates. A lot of people aren't even aware that there are multiple unemployment rates, but remember the official unemployment rate is the U3, which is total unemployed as a percent of the civilian labor force. So going forward, we're going to definitely want to keep our eye on U5 and U6 as well, because this includes the people marginally attached to the labor force, as well as U6 also includes workers who were part-time for economic reasons. And with these, you're generally going to want to use the seasonally adjusted numbers. And already you can see there's a pretty big difference between U3 and U6 from 14.7% to 22.8%. So it'll be very important to note if these diverge more in the future, because remember U3 only includes people who are actively looking for work in the last 4 weeks. So if there's a large segment who gets discouraged or just stops actively looking for work, they will drop off the U3 unemployment, but they will still show up in U5 and U6. So we could potentially have a situation in the future where the U3 rate stays steady or even starts to decline, while U5 and U6 remains elevated or even perhaps increases. So make sure you're keeping an eye on this chart every month. And finally, let's take a look at table A16. I like this one because it breaks down the people who are not in the labor force. So here we can see that since last April, almost 8 million people have left the labor force. There are now 104 million Americans 16 and over who are not considered to be in the labor force, which means that they're not going to be included in things like the labor force participation rate. And of those, almost 10 million say that they want a job. That's an increase of almost 5 million from the year prior. And again, those people who want a job are not included in the official unemployment rate. And then it also includes people who are marginally attached to the labor force, the discouraged workers, and other persons marginally attached to the labor force. And we can see that all these categories have spiked since the year prior, but it'll be something to keep your eye on going forward, as they could very well continue to increase. And remember, these aren't counted in the official unemployment rate, so something to keep your eye on, and this is where you find that information. On the bottom of this table is a section on multiple job holders, which is kind of a cool little nugget. Sometimes you hear the narrative that in order to put food on the table or make ends meet, people are having to work 2 or 3 jobs. But this isn't really the case if we look at the data. Even if we look at last year, there's just 5% of total workers held multiple jobs. And even that drops considerably if we were looking at those who were working full-time. So if you're ever looking for the data on multiple job holders, here it is tucked in the bottom of table A16 of all places. So to recap, the BLS publishes their employment data every month, normally on the morning of the first Friday, but sometimes it'll be on the second Friday. To access this data, just type in BLS Employment Summary into your search engine, and that'll bring you right there. You'll want to read the synopsis as well as look for any notes at the bottom. Remember, in the last report, if we failed to do that, we wouldn't have seen that important note about significantly undercounting the unemployed by as much as perhaps 5%. Then you want to take a look at Summary Table A and Summary Table B, and then also take a look at tables A, 14, 15, and 16. If you do all this, then there'll be no real reason to read any media reports on unemployment since you already know more than what they're going to tell you. And if you do read reports, you'll be much better able to tell if they're trying to omit things or craft a narrative to mislead you. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already done so. And until next time, so long.